What's really cool is to pause itself is an act of courage when your
Ooh.
brain is sending a signal that there's a saber-toothed tiger. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Simply Human podcast. And this is the podcast where we explore the common challenges of our shared human experiences. I'm Dr. Christina Caro, clinical psychologist.
And I'm Karen Linsky, leadership and self-trust coach.
First of all, I want to just thank everybody for being really patient. I've been traveling and Karen's been helping by taking over solo. Karen, thank you so much for doing that. These were much needed vacations. So I really appreciate that.
An exciting time for you. That's kind of fun.
So today we are going to explore this paradox of avoidance in the sense of how things that feel like they're protecting us and actually we
Mhm.
feel like it's making us safe, but at the same time, it can make our world much smaller and can also have some adverse mental health consequences. But before we start, consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel because those small steps really do help us reach more people.
So it's very interesting you say a smaller world as you avoid more and more and more. So when you say smaller world, what does that look like in someone's daily life? So we can give people that context.
This is a really big topic. And what I was thinking is this is going to be the beginning of a series so we can get more specific. We've done a past episode on avoiding conflict. But this is such a big issue, avoidance, and particularly how it can make our world really small. It breaks down into a whole bunch of different areas. We're going to cover a generalized view of how avoidance can show up in our lives. And then in future episodes, we'll break down maybe specific ones. And if there's something you are specifically interested in, please leave a comment below on what areas is avoidance affecting you, because that'll help guide us on the episodes coming in the future. Avoidance is an ancient survival mechanism, and we've talked about the fight, flight, freeze response, and most people have heard about that, that there's different ways we are hardwired to protect ourselves. We might fight a predator, we might run, flee from a predator, we can freeze and dissociate. And the reality is that our brain and our nervous system is wired to prioritize safety over a newer aspect of our brain, which is growth. Now, I was just thinking before we started this episode, Karen, there's a lot of stigma around mental health and going and seeking out like help of a mental health care provider. So that stigma has often framed seeking mental health services as being weak,
Mhm.
right? It's like, oh, what's wrong with you? It's kind of weak. But the reality is, when people go and seek help, they are choosing to confront something. And I consider that to be incredibly brave, incredibly courageous. And it's going against this wiring that is to seek comfort and safety over confronting something that stresses us out. I just wanted to put that out there because I'm a mental health care provider, folks, and I always want to encourage people to start reframing and recognizing how courageous you are. The problem with avoidance is that it is a self reinforcing coping strategy. Because at a very primitive level, most of you are aware of this reward punishment cycle where something we're rewarded for, we continue doing more of it. Something that is painful or there's a punishment, we will do less of. So let's think about avoidance. The avoidance cycle is I'm feeling uncomfortable about something. Something is scaring me, something just feels distressing, it feels uncomfortable. So if I take the flight response, the avoidance response, I get myself out of the discomfort. Now I don't feel it. That's my reward. I feel better. Therefore, avoidance was a good strategy. So I will keep doing avoidance. And we can get into this cycle of
Mm.
reinforcing one particular way of getting to safety. And what we're going to talk about today is how that is not always the best strategy to use because it has some unintended consequences. This is where I like to remind people about the brain. Okay. And this is a model that I learned that I thought was great. And I'm gonna show it to you here. So imagine this is the brain. Okay. Here's like the noodly part we're all familiar with. This is the front of your brain, your prefrontal cortex. And the noodly part is what we call the neocortex or the new brain.
Mhm.
And then if you were to lift off the neocortex, you would find something shaped kind of in an arc. And that's our limbic brain, or what we call the lizard brain. This is the part of the brain where we are more instinctive. It's fight, flight, freeze. It's
Mhm.
really wired towards safety, procreation, continuation of the species. And then we have our brain stem that is where we have all our autonomic processes that are regulated, like our breathing and our heart rate, all these things we don't even think about that just work. The thing is, our brain didn't evolve from the primitive brain to the new brain. It's like we have this old lizard brain and then a brand new brain slapped on top of it. So they're both trying to run at the same time. And for I know our audience is mostly kind of our age, Karen. So you all might remember back in the day, like computers used to run on DOS operating system. And then when Windows came out, right, you had this beautiful interface and all these colors, and you just point and click and things seem to happen. But the thing is, that new interface was slapped over DOS.
Mhm.
And even though it looked all like easy to do, what you see is what you get. When it would crash, it would be DOS and you would get the blue screen of death.
Mm.
So if anybody's had blue screen of death with their Windows, that's this sort of difference between the new cortex and the limbic brain. Or another example, if you guys are not computer people, think about a home smoke detector. A smoke detector, it's there to alert you about a potential catastrophic danger, but
Mhm.
it's a pretty primitive device. But even if they hardwire it in and make it look all fancy, the reality, and I know this, I'm a cook, my smoke detector cannot tell the difference between, like, if I'm steaming vegetables or taking a shower.
It's true.
Can't
It's true. It just goes off.
Right, how
Exactly.
many times have I've had
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
jump out of the shower and then go fan the steam away from the
Oh, I
smoke
know.
alarm.
Oh, yeah. Like
So,
joy.
the reality is this is really similar to how our brain
Mm.
it's like it's only a millisecond before that fight, flight, freeze process goes into
Yeah.
effect.
Yeah.
And it's before the new brain can evaluate, is this steam? Is this a house on fire? Is this
Mhm.
a real life-threatening threat, or is this just discomfort? And by the time our rational brain or our neocortex comes online to say, oh, wait a minute, this is just a difficult conversation, it's not mortal danger, we've already been flooded with stress hormones and stress chemicals, and that avoidance pattern might have already kicked in. It isn't exactly a design flaw that we have this new brain on top of an old brain because we need that instinct, but it does create situations where our reaction isn't proportional to what the actual situation is.
Oh, wow. I just love that analogy because that's so true. What you're talking about, that analogy, is just like our brains are essentially stuck in this lizard mode.
Well, it's not exactly stuck as much as we say limbic hijacked. So it's like you have your pilot. A way to think about the neocortex is it's the pilot of the plane,
Mm.
and then hijackers came in and, and took over the plane. So, what do you think, Karen? Like, how do you think this connects to your coaching and self trust? Like, do you think people are avoiding because they don't trust themselves to handle the discomfort that their lizard brain is signaling might be a threat?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. One of the key areas of my coaching is addressing self trust. I noticed in my decades of consulting and coaching that Many professionals who avoid, like an earlier version of myself, I'll admit that,
Mm.
have learned not to trust our own capacity to really handle difficult emotions, or what I call perceived outcomes, like the stories or tell ourselves that in that perceived outcome, stay away. Then we repeatedly choose a safe option. And the problem with that is we never get the chance to get the evidence that we need to handle that harder thing. And then it becomes a self fulfilling prophecy where we think, I can't handle the conflict. Because our
Mm.
internal danger stories actually say, stop, don't do it, you're going to get in trouble. Oh no, the world is falling. That's what I mean by smaller world, too. So then we avoid it, which really means that we never develop the skills to handle. And I had to work on what you just mentioned, recognizing the signs and turning off that lizard switch. And it took years to recognize that. And I slowly
Yeah.
build and build more and more that muscle and ability to reframe the conflict as information instead of reinforcing that belief over and over again that I couldn't handle it. Right? It was too big of a
Mhm.
conflict, or letting my stories run rapid in my brain and avoid it.
Yeah, and avoidance can become really quite problematic, and I
Oh, yeah.
really love the way you describe that is it is a skill of
Hmm.
learning to take a moment to figure out, is this really a threat? And it takes time to practice. I can handle this by the behaviors that we choose. And so, like you said, it's like exercising a muscle. So let's go into when avoidance becomes problematic.
Hmm.
I like to say that there is a difference between healthy caution and
Mm.
limiting avoidance.
Hmm.
Okay, that's the
Definitely.
distinction we want to make. How avoidance generalizes and spreads, it can be something like a fear of driving becomes a fear of traveling beyond a really small radius around our home. And that really limits our ability to, say, go and visit family who live outside of that radius, or to even do something like go to a doctor's appointment. So now not only are we avoiding driving, we're also avoiding going to the doctor because maybe it's outside of our comfort zone. Or
Yeah.
maybe it's about, lately in the news, there was a slew of weird near misses and in the airlines, and there was all
Oh,
this, um,
yeah.
yeah,
That's
turmoil
so
going.
true. I remember
Right?
that now. Yeah.
Hey, even I called my buddy who's a pilot and said, should I be concerned? Okay, so hearing about this can lead to actually a complete avoidance of flying altogether, or social anxiety. I'm someone with autism, and before I knew about the autism, I really struggled with social anxiety and used avoidance. But then that leads to increased isolation, which can create more loneliness. And then, say, for example, financial anxiety might lead to avoiding budgeting. Like, I've worked with a lot of clients around this. Like, they don't even want to look. They're so terrified they don't wanna look, and so they actually never learn how to budget, and then because they don't even wanna think about what they're spending money on and they don't budget, they end up in more debt and more financial crisis, and so it's just this spiral. And as a therapist, it's really interesting because, like I said, most people come into therapy, they're taking that courageous step to come and confront, but
Mhm.
it's not like I don't see patients who come in and after a while, I know we're getting close to the thing because suddenly they're chatting about everyday things, or they're talking about things that
Oh,
are
that thing.
interrelated. They'll use the whole hour to talk about something that's not the thing. So avoidance also happens in the therapy room, and it's something I have to gently bring attention to so we can explore how do we move beyond this. I call this a shrinking life phenomenon.
Oh, I
It might
love that term, the shrinking life phenomenon. That's a good one. Keep going. Sorry to interrupt. I just
it happens really gradually, by
yeah.
the way, and pretty insidiously, kinda like
Mm,
the frog in the boiling pot of water. Like, you don't notice as it gradually the temperature goes up because it's these little avoidances over and over and over again. And it might mean I felt uncomfortable or insecure about my work experience. So then I avoid even applying to something that might be a stretch. Or maybe there's a relationship. Maybe I like this person, but I'm too anxious or insecure, so I don't even take that chance to try to get to know the person.
Yeah, I think I use avoidance a lot. But what's interesting even now, even though I'm getting much better, especially in my professional life, but in my personal life sometimes, when you think about the signs, when you actually can notice yourself crossing from that reasonable caution to that problematic avoidance, what are some of those signs?
Maybe I didn't touch much on the reasonable caution, but remember our brain is wired to keep us alive, and so reasonable caution is something like, "Oh, it's the middle of the night and I'm walking alone in a dark alley." Like, maybe that's not a good idea. That's reasonable
Okay.
caution.
Okay.
Avoiding cities altogether, that's
Right. That's the
going to right,
problematic.
right, right.
Mm.
One of the ways that you can start trying to question yourself, like, am I engaging in this problematic avoidance? Is starting to look at what those hidden costs are that I just mentioned.
Mm.
Are you noticing increased of isolation and loneliness? You might be avoiding because of social anxiety. Are you finding that your world is becoming really small? So you're looking for things like anxiety related to a certain type of action. You're looking for possible depression due to isolation and loneliness, and something which I call the accumulation of existential losses.
Mm.
So, the loss of the sense of myself because I'm not doing the things that used to define my sense of self, or loss of connection to family because I'm too scared to make the trip to get there. Like I was talking to a client whose parents hadn't seen their grandchildren because they kept avoiding, the long trip to travel across country. So that's an existential loss, not only for them to not get to enjoy their grandchildren, but for the grandchildren to not get to know their grandparents. I don't know, Karen. Those are some examples in personal life. How does this show up in like that distinction in leadership or in professional context?
So my experience working with organizations and leaders, there's an avoidance I see a lot, which is avoiding the difficult conversations, such as a performance issue that you have, or when someone didn't meet the expectation that you perceived as agreed upon, or maybe you're delaying a decision because you're waiting for more information and to make sure you're not going to be wrong, right?
Mm.
Or until the choice is obvious. I even did this, right? I know that leaders tend to avoid, not because they lack the skills, but because they don't really trust themselves to handle the emotional fallout. They're afraid of disappointing people. I knew I was like that for sure, damaging their reputation or being seen as like giving feedback and being known as the bad manager versus the good manager, right? And I think that's labeling, that's always happening in our stories because that's that, warning, warning, better not, right? So in my coaching, I like to focus that the anxiety or that avoidance actually creates more complexity later. So if you don't address someone's performance in the moment, it'll become a bigger issue if you only address it at the designated end of the year discussion when it's a little bit too late to change their behavior.
Yeah.
And that's what I do a lot with my coaching now is get people to deal with the discomfort and to use the conflict as information instead of avoiding again. And or think about even a delayed decision. You got to wait. But now with that manageable uncertainty, you're never going to get all the information that you need. And then you could actually create a crisis that you don't even know you're going to create. I think it's interesting because we think we're actually protecting our reputations and our relationships, but we're actually creating situations that damage each even more.
You know what? Your experiences was really similar to mine in the work
Mhm.
environment. Probably one of the last organization development interventions I did was a bunch of mid-level managers who they were really upfront about engaging in how much they avoided, and it was about what you said, the interpersonal. These were all engineers, and they're like, "Oh, man, becoming a manager, I went from doing technical work to now 90% of my work is interpersonal, and I feel completely
It's true.
anxious
It's true.
about that."
Yeah.
And so they're like, "Yeah, no, I just, like, keep my head down and try to avoid those situations." And then what happened was we were called in because now an employee morale problem. Because
Mm,
of the avoidance, the way it was experienced by the employees was that their managers didn't care. Yeah, very, very similar experience. So, how do we reframe fear and discomfort so that we can find a more adaptive response? And it's exactly what you just said, that fear is information, it's not instruction. So,
mm,
fear is a signal first. It's a signal of a potential threat. And an acronym for fear that is sometimes true, false evidence appearing real. This is where we have to have the time for the neocortex to kick in to determine, is this false evidence appearing real, or is there a genuine threat? We have to start differentiating between what is comfort and what is safety. Okay, safety is that reasonable caution. We want to be safe. We don't want to be in danger. We don't want to be harmed. But when we start lumping every discomfort as danger,
mhm,
then we move into, well, then I must have to seek comfort, seek comfort, seek comfort.
mm,
And that is where we can start having our life get smaller and smaller and smaller. So, what we want to do is introduce this concept of productive discomfort. And we've actually talked about it in past episodes when we've talked about growth, is knowing where the boundary is between comfort, productive discomfort, and then overwhelming discomfort. And that productive discomfort, that's the zone of growth. Because when we cross into overwhelming discomfort, then that is truly when we are in full blown stress chemicals, we are in fight, flight, freeze. Our new brain actually becomes hypoactive, and our ability to process and learn slows down. So we're not in a growth zone at all. What we want to be is in the growth zone, which is mildly uncomfortable, but my brain is still working and I could do things like analyze it, try to figure out if there's a way to mitigate the risk, do some cost benefit analysis, weigh risks versus reward, and then experiment with going somewhat outside our comfort zone, but before we hit the stress zone. And then we also want to start looking at fear is not the instruction for action. We want courage to be what we cultivate. And courage is that action of confronting fear with our whole heart. And we're willing to take action. So, as a reminder, courage comes from the word heart.
mm.
So it is to show up in the face of fear with our whole heart and to be willing to take action.
So I love because when you say that, it's so interesting because some of the additional distinctions that you're talking about was even that body awareness, right? Where
Yeah.
you have that grounded pause. And so instead of just going right into it, like you've had this discomfort and then you pause. One of the things we
Yeah.
always talk about is feeling it here in your body is the best way
Mhm.
because that's where it goes first. And you feel that, and then you just pause for a minute to just say, what is this about? And then there's another thing that we've talked about before was that time orientation, because the importance of that being in the present moment, whereas sometimes I go in the future
Mm.
catastrophizing, especially with this level of uncertainty. It's so easy to go into the future
Yeah.
catastrophizing. But I talked about when you were gone in an episode about what if, what if, what if, and getting to that what if spiral of catastrophizing and the importance of that present moment assessment. And then what
Yeah.
you said earlier about that courage and some openness to understand about the level of uncertainty.
That is such a good point about the body awareness. And a way to think about this and on how do we start cultivating this practice is the willingness to stay in the discomfort with self compassion and curiosity, because that helps us build resilience,
Mm-hmm,
its capacity, its wisdom. When we're
mm-hmm,
able to stay, keep our brain online, actually think, learn, develop memory,
mm,
and time to reflect on what are the boundaries that I need? what is it that I really want to do when we think about, do I want to keep my world as large as possible? So the more we align with our boundaries, values, and desires and take action towards our values versus avoiding discomfort, the less we self abandon and the more we learn to trust ourselves.
So I'd like to switch over now to giving our audience some practical strategies for expanding beyond avoidance.
Okay. Yeah. I want to introduce a concept of minimal viable courage. Because
Ooh,
when we talk about courage all the time, Karen, I know that I've come across
it's
people
like,
who say, I'm not courageous. They actually don't self-identify as being courageous. So let's give you this idea of minimal viable
ooh,
courage. So
I love that.
minimal viable meaning to live, to be to put into action, to be alive, but it's just a little bit. So we have this tiny window, as we've mentioned, before our limbic brain hijacks the neocortex.
Mhm.
And in that is where we cultivate the ability to pause and then ask a curiosity question. What's really cool is to pause itself is an act of courage when
Ooh,
your brain is sending a signal that there's an saber-toothed tiger. It's perceiving an imminent threat, but the reality is we actually are rarely in that type of harm's way. So you can safely cultivate the pause, but it does take courage to pause because your brain is saying don't pause. Your brain is saying act and react. So
oh,
that's huge.
totally. Love that.
I'm going to put a link below to my favorite resource by Pema Chodron, who is world renowned American Buddhist monk. She does a lot of teaching in mental health, addiction, and Buddhist spirituality. And she has this great audio. It's a recording of a workshop. So this isn't a book. This is a workshop, which I love because there's an audience and you can hear them laughing, and it's called Getting Unstuck. And so I'll put the link below. And this is about the practice of learning to pause, sit in the discomfort with curiosity and self compassion. And if you get this audio and you listen to it, you will be well on the way on starting to shift from perhaps a habitual pattern of avoidance into starting to regain your life again. Now, the other thing we talked about was that exposure, figuring out where your boundary is on comfort, and then exposing yourself to manageable discomfort. That's this gradual approach because once you get comfortable in the growth zone, your comfort level boundary stretches. And now there's a new discomfort zone, but it's a very gradual process. And then finally, distinguishing between what you're avoiding, what's the situation, and what you're really avoiding, which might
Mm,
be the feelings about the
mm,
situation. Because if you can make that distinction, which is this is just as a situation, is it objectively life threatening? And this is what I'm feeling, which is overwhelmed, terrified, whatever those feelings are. And again, you pause, self compassion, calm down your nervous system so that your neocortex works again. So you can actually do some evaluation and through this process, actually build some distress tolerance. Actually, all of these steps helps build your threshold and tolerance for discomfort so that you aren't constantly reacting by choosing that avoidance strategy and just making your world smaller and smaller and smaller.
This brings me back to a time when I was younger, and it seemed as though I was always avoiding because the way I was growing up, there's a tendency for me to avoid conflict.
Mm.
And I remember at that moment in time, I don't think I even knew what I wanted because I avoided for so long. So, do you have any advice for that person who has avoided for so long that they don't know what they want?
Yeah, that is a really tough one. Although, Karen, if we think back to your experience, I think this will resonate for you. But what I would say is when you become aware of the experience of grief,
Mm,
it's a great indicator that something has been unintentionally lost through avoidance. It might be freedom, might be confidence, could be self-trust. It could be joy in activities you used to do. It might be
Yeah.
connection. So there's a sense deep down of loss. This is actually what I did my dissertation on, is the experience of existential grief. And there was nothing on this topic when I did my literature review, yet I saw it all around me. Karen, you're not alone. I think that most people probably use avoidance because the other options, so that's flight, is fight and freeze. So there's a
Mhm,
percentage of the
mhm,
population that does freeze dissociate.
mhm,
But the population that goes into fight, it's actually a much smaller. I mean, just think about people who join the military. Only 1% of our population will enlist in military to become warriors. It's a small percentage that instinctively go into fight.
mhm.
Most people go into avoidance. So you're not alone. And what I was seeing was so much of this grief related to existential losses like freedom, confidence, joy. So if you follow the grief trail, grief shows us that ache when we see others doing things that we've avoided.
Mhm,
Envy. It could also be
mhm.
envy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Notice what makes you feel wistful or regretful, because
Yeah,
that's data about
yeah.
lost connection to what you really value. And then additional reconnection strategies. What do you find yourself envying in others? And what would you choose if avoidance wasn't possible? For example,
Love that.
if you weren't going to avoid, if there wasn't this sense of threat in your body, would you choose to go get in that car and do that trip? Like, would you choose to go engage in that conversation if you didn't have this sensation? And then
Mm,
finally, I find that when this existential loss is really building up, you feel it in your body. You feel almost like exhausted, depleted, unmotivated. Like everything feels a little flat. You just find yourself kind of vegging out. And so ask yourself, "God, what would make me feel more alive in this moment?" And this will start to point you towards what it is that you may have lost. And then you can ask, what was I avoiding? Why was I avoiding this?
so can you explain what you mean by that word existential?
Existential.
Sorry, I'm not even saying it
Existential.
completely right. I'm sorry.
So existential is really, think of the word exist. It's related to existence. That's what existential is. It was a philosophy. It is a form of psychology, existential humanistic psychology. I consider
Mm,
myself an existential humanist because the nature of my work is, who are we authentically? And what are the courageous choices we need so that our existence is authentic to who we were meant to be?
oh, okay. Perfect. So why don't we close? So what would be an invitation that you would have to our audience in our closing?
I would say, here's the practice: reflect on one area in your life where avoidance might be keeping your world smaller than it could be. If you don't even know how, like, well, how would I even start doing that? Think about your core values. So, for example, say you have a core value around family. So then ask yourself, have I made choices that's making my world smaller and I am not aligned with my values around family? Or, for example, say for me, one of my core values is adventure. And if I had started avoiding travel, I would
Mm,
have to say, wait a minute, am I aligning with that value around adventure if I'm never willing to travel, outside 10 miles around my home? So that can help get you started on identifying where, like you had said, Karen, where might avoidance be happening, where it's become so habitual that I've forgotten what it is that I even really want. So your values will help to reorient. And then ask yourself, what would become possible if I took one small step towards the discomfort? So that would be the practice.
yeah, I love that. So I want to invite the audience to share your experiences using this practice in one area that you're avoiding. Any questions you might have or future topics of interest in the comments below, or email us at simplyhuman.connect@gmail.com. And please hit the like button, subscribe to get notified when new episodes drop, and share with friends who could use this message. It helps not just the algorithm, but gives us the encouragement to continue to bring this type of content to you.
Yeah, and then, folks, as I said in the beginning, if there are specific areas of avoidance that you would like us to go in a deeper dive on, please put that into the comments, share your story, and we will try to have some focused episodes on those specific aspects of avoidance. Because, like I said, most people, at least in our society, do engage in avoidance. And we
Mhm.
also have one of the highest levels of anxiety and depression anywhere in the world for first world country. So I do think that there is an aspect of this that is key to becoming aware of so we can live our best lives. So until next time, guys, stay curious, stay kind, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Bye,
Bye.
y'all.